it's a pleasure to present this even virtually, but still a great pleasure to be here and present. As Doug was saying, this is joint work with Jesper at the IMF and Matthias Trabant at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And the usual disclaimer applies. So these are our own views and not necessarily those of the Bank of Canada in the IMF. And this paper is called Understanding Post-COVID Inflation Dynamics. So just to motivate the topic, I think it's like for all of us, it's clear that there's been a very sharp increase in inflation after the COVID shock hit, and that's what you see on the right-hand side of the chart here. So this is core inflation, removing the more volatile components of inflation for the US in blue, Canada in orange, and the Euro area in yellow. And why I think this sharp increase in inflation took us a little bit by surprise to many of us is if we go back in time, we had seen that inflation had been relatively stable, and in particular that there is a large body of empirical evidence documenting that the slope of the Phillips curve had been in fact flattening over the last decades. And this is what you see if you look at the first vertical line here that depicts the onset of the Great Recession. So we see there that despite the large drop in output that happened, particularly in the US, inflation didn't move much back then. So what we try and do in this paper is basically try to reconcile these two pieces of sort of conflicting evidence, where we try to explain in a joint framework the missing deflation puzzle that we saw during the Great Recession and the recent surge in inflation after the pandemic hit. And this is somewhat, conflicting in the sense that if you think the Phillips curve had really flattened over the last couple of decades, this seems to be somewhat, at least, inconsistent with the large increase in inflation that we saw during the boom after the pandemic. And so the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to study recent US inflation and output dynamics using the workhorse Smets-and-Wouters new Keynesian model, so very standard framework. But the key feature that we are going to be leveraging here is the Kimball state-dependent demand elasticity faced by intermediate good producers in the model. And this state-dependent elasticity is going to be key in our framework, because what this is going to deliver is going to be a state-dependent Phillips curve slope and state-dependent propagation of shocks. And we're going to be focusing in particular in cost-push shocks, because there is like a broad consensus that cost-push shocks were a main driver of inflation after the pandemic. Here, I want to also stress that that this paper is not going to be exclusively about trying to reconcile the sort of missing deflation puzzle with the increasing inflation after the pandemic, but more generally, what this framework delivers is a distribution of inflation that is consistent with the empirical distribution of inflation. So we are going to have a very positively skewed distribution of inflation, where inflation has a large and fat right tail, but is almost capped at zero with very few negative realizations of inflation or deflation. Okay, so let me just guide you through our main results in a nutshell. So the main argument of the paper is that you're going to see that our variant of the Smets-and-Wouters model explains the modest decline in inflation that we saw during the Great Recession and its recent post-COVID surge better than the original Smets-and-Wouters model. And here, the nonlinear formulation will be especially helpful, because the nonlinear model is going to be able to leverage the state-dependent demand elasticity that is embedded in the Kimball framework. And as I was saying, this is going to give us a Phillips curve that is going to be steeper during booms, and it's going to be flatter during recessions. We are also going to have that cost-push shocks are going to be amplified during booms and muted during recessions. And finally, in a somewhat concerning note, we are going to see that the policy trade-off to stabilize inflation for the central bank becomes larger as baseline inflation increases. Okay, so that's those are the main messages. And let me now jump into the maybe before doing this, I will take the opportunity to see if there are any questions so far.
Policy trade-off to stabilize inflation becomes larger, okay?
Yeah.
Like if I was to think about this as a trade-off, like a convex function or something, what do you mean by larger? Like there are a larger range of variation that you can choose from? What do I mean by larger?
It's going to be larger in the sense that the cost of bringing down a certain increase in inflation is going to imply a larger GDP cost. So it's going to be larger in terms of GDP cost and the increase in the policy rate that you need for a given increase in inflation.
Okay.
So if you're say close to target and there is like an inflation shock hitting the economy, you are going to have to raise the interest rate by say X. But if you are in a high inflation state and the same shock happens, you are going to have to increase the policy rate by say 2X, and that's going to have also a larger effect in GDP, a larger cost in terms of GDP gap. So that's
I would say steeper then. Okay.
Yeah.
Then it would be really clear.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the idea. Yeah. So in the next, so the way I'm going to lay out the presentation is now I'm going to talk a little bit about the model. Then I'm going to guide you quickly through the calibration and estimation, and then I'm going to show you the results. So as I was saying, we work with a nonlinear formulation of the Smets and Wouters model, and the key element here for our paper is going to be the Kimball aggregator, and this is what I'm showing you in this slide. So as standard in any Nuke-Engine model, we're going to have intermediate good producers and a final good producer that aggregates those intermediate goods. And the Kimball aggregator refers to how those intermediate goods are aggregated. So we're going to have competitive firms that are going to aggregate this intermediate goods YTF into a final good capital YT using this technology here, this integral over this implicitly defined G function here. So you see that the Kimball aggregator is a general formulation of perhaps the more standard Dixit-Stiglitz aggregator. What we do in order to you have to come up with a function for this G. And what we do here is that we follow Dotzy and King and Levin, Lopez Salido, and Yoon, and we use their formulation of this G function, where this phi here is going to be the gross markup, and this psi parameter is going to be summarizing the degree of curvature in the Kimball demand functions. Okay, and why we choose to follow this approach is that this gives you a very nice formulation of the aggregator where when psi is larger than 0, you are in the Kimball world. But if you set that psi equal to 0, you are back to the Dixit-Stiglitz case. So this formulation of the Kimball aggregator embeds the Dixit-Stiglitz as a particular case. And this is very nice because it allows us to, for example, do robustness checks and ask, what would happen to our results if we were to shut down, say, the state-dependent demand elasticity completely and work with the Dixit-Stiglitz case, which is a CES type of demand. So essentially, this is a more general formulation of the aggregator than the standard Dixit-Stiglitz case. Okay. Now, why does this framework generate the nice inflation dynamics that, or I don't know if nice, but like the inflation dynamics in the model that bring the model closer to the data? I want to guide you through the intuition behind the mechanism. So the Kimball aggregator introduces strategic complementarities between firms. And this implies that effectively firms face a quasi-kinked demand, as you see in the left-hand side chart here. So what this means is that demand elasticity is going to be an increasing function of price. So what you are seeing in the left-hand side chart here is that if you as a firm want to cut your prices your demand is going to become more inelastic. So as a matter of fact, you are going to find it challenging to attract more demand, to crowd in demand by cutting your prices, because your demand at the same time becomes more inelastic. Okay. Now, what's the implication of that? This implies that the marginal revenue of the firm is going to be a concave function of price. And this is what you see in the middle chart here. And to understand the implications of this, it's interesting to look at how changes in the marginal cost are going to affect optimal relative prices of firms. So say you start in a situation where you have a medium marginal cost depicted by the black broken line here. So if a firm faces a shock that lowers its marginal cost, you're going to see that the optimal price is going to move by relatively little in the pink line here. By contrast, if the firm faces a shock that increases its marginal cost, you're going to see that the price is going to adjust by much more. And you see this in the red upper line here. So to summarize this relationship, we're plotting in the last chart on the right here, the optimal price as a function of marginal cost. And you see that this is a convex relationship. So this implies that, for example, when marginal costs are relatively low or decreasing, optimal price is going to be relatively insensitive to changes in marginal cost. And this slope is going to be relatively flat. Now, if you're in a situation where marginal costs are elevated or increasing towards the right of the chart here, you're going to see that optimal price becomes much more sensitive to changes in marginal cost. So the key message here is that firms are going to increase their prices sharply when marginal costs increase, but they are not going to cut their prices as much when marginal costs fall. And this is the key asymmetry that is going to deliver the asymmetric distribution of inflation in the model. So let me just, having said that, let me guide you through like the implications of this framework for first a linearized version of the model and then a nonlinear version of the model. And this is going to be important because we're always going to have the linearized framework as a benchmark to compare our results from the nonlinear model. So what are the implications of the Kimball aggregator in the linearized model? Here I'm showing you the linearized Phillips curve of the model. Okay, and this is exactly what you would get from the linearized Smets-Wouters model. So on the left-hand side here you have inflation with a parameter of indexation, and on the right-hand side you have the component of inflation expectations, and then the slope of the Phillips curve kappa multiplying variations in the marginal cost, and finally this epsilon hat is a cost push shock or a markup shock. Okay. And so you see that this kappa here, the slope of the Phillips curve, as usual, is going to be simply a combination of parameters, where this psi p here is going to be the Calvo parameter, beta is going to be the discount factor, phi is going to be the gross markup, and epsilon is the Kimball curvature. So what Kimball adds is effectively this term in orange here, where you see it effectively adds an extra term to the denominator. So in the linearized world, you simply get a flattening of the Phillips curve for a given set of the other parameters in the model, the Calvo parameter, the discount factor, and the gross markup. So this is why it is still important in a linearized model to perhaps consider, Kimball aggregation, because it will allow you to have like a smaller slope of the Phillips curve, given your Calvo parameter, which is, as I was saying, consistent with what we have seen in recent evidence. But it's also important to note that you will have the same kappa for different combinations of these parameters. So, for a given Calvo parameter, you can then come up with a model with Kimball that will have the same kappa if you just change the Calvo parameter and add this epsilon p here. Because remember, when this epsilon p is 0, you are back in the Stiglitz case. The implication of this is that you are going to have models in the Dixit-Stiglitz world and in the Kimball world that are going to be observationally equivalent for different combinations of these parameters. So basically, you can always sort of reach what you would like to have in terms of the Phillips curve with Kimball in the Dixit-Stiglitz world for some combinations of parameters. And this is going to be totally different in the nonlinear model. So in the nonlinear model, we don't have an analytical expression for kappa anymore, okay? So we only have a system of equations that I'm showing you here, summarizing the first order conditions referring to the pricing problem of the firm. And what we are going to have is that we can only infer the slope of the Phillips curve doing model simulations. So it's not going to be so important for us to go through the details of these equations here. I just want to show you that in this system, now the markup and the sort of the markup or cost push shock here enters multiplicatively with the marginal cost and output, not additively like I was showing you here in the previous slide. Okay, so on top of the state dependence in the Phillips curve that I'm going to show you and the flattening and steepening of the curve, we are also going to have that this cost push shock is going to propagate. It's also going to be state dependent, because you can already see here that, depending on whether markups and output are going to be high or low, the effect of a given shock will be different. So I will just say very briefly how we estimate and calibrate the model, and then maybe I can take some questions before jumping into the result. So we are going to follow our previous JME paper to parameterize the model. So what we do is we estimate the linearized model on pre-Great Financial Crisis data. And we are going to depart from Smets and Wouter's original paper in one important way. So Smets and Wouter's estimate gross markup that is 61%, and that is much higher than has been documented in the literature. So what we're going to do is we're going to impose a tighter prior on that steady state gross markup. We're going to fix the Calvo price parameter in line with micro evidence to 0.67, and we're going to estimate the Kimball parameter. Smets and Wouter's estimate the Calvo parameter and fix the Kimball parameter. So by doing this change in the approach, what we're going to get is we're going to get a lower steady state markup. We get something like 35%, which is still relatively high, but much lower than 61% that estimated by Smets and Wouters. And we're going to get a higher Kimball curvature parameter. So Smets and Wouters calibrate the Kimball parameter to a value of 10, and we're going to get an elasticity value of 65. So again, just to summarize, what we achieve with this is we achieve a lower markup in line with empirical evidence, and we achieve a higher Kimball curvature parameter, which essentially gives a more prominent role for the Kimball state-dependent demand, which is going to be key for our results. Okay. And the way that we are going to then solve the model and use the model also to do filtering exercises and taking the nonlinear model to the data is that we are going to be using the extended path method as developed by Fair and Taylor. And what this implies in practice is that we are able to do stochastic simulations in the nonlinear model under certainty equivalent. This is very nice because, of course, certainty equivalence is imposed in the linearized model by construction. So what this solution approach gives us is precisely the difference between the nonlinearity of the first order conditions in the nonlinear model with respect to the linearized model, getting rid of all the effects that come from uncertainty. So that's going to be the way we solve the model. So I will stop here and see if there are any questions so far.
Martin, I have a question.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. So you're making the point that you have to go non-linear in order to understand what happened with inflation, basically. But
Right,
then you
yeah.
start by a linearized model. So why don't you estimate it using already some nonlinear technique to get it nonlinearly?
Yeah, so that's of course a great question. So it's basically because we are working on that, and the model is still relatively large to be estimated nonlinearly. So we are trying to leverage some, approach by, for example, Gust, Herbst, Lopez Salido, and Smith, who estimate like fully nonlinear new Keynesian model, but that model is still much smaller than the model that we have here. So it is still computational challenge to estimate the fully nonlinear model. But you are of course right. So if we could do that, that would be the best way to do it. And and we're working on that. So hopefully soon we can have a nonlinear estimation.
Yeah, I have a question. Hello.
Yeah. Hey.
I was just wondering, you do the filtering also with Linear. Did I understand that correctly? You filter the shocks or from the data, or?
Correct. So it's not a pre-programmed function of Linear, but we can use the extended path method as the function of the extended path method, basically. To do the filtering. So how this works is you are going to simulate the model using the extended path method at each point in time, and you are going to use a nonlinear solver to find the shocks that make the model match the data at every given period. It's a very similar approach to, for example, what Guerreri and Carcavelos do in their JME paper. I don't know if you're familiar with their filtering, this sort of, they call this like an inversion filter, where you try to invert the model to back out the shocks that make the model equal to the data for the observable variables, right?
Are you like giving basically, are you basically like programming the data as a shock, yeah, and filter then out endogenously filter out the, like in Linear terms, you give you program the data as a shock, and then you filter, you pretend the shock is an endogenous variable, and you filter that, you take that out, or?
No. So the data is going to be the data, and I mean, just to, maybe I can explain this in 1 minute maybe. So what we're going to have is, you're going to have the data, you are going to have some initial conditions, let's say the steady state or some point in the model where you start, and you are going to have some structural shocks that make the say observed variables in the model equal to the data. Say GDP in the model must be equal to GDP in the data for some structural shock, okay? So what we are going to do is, given the initial conditions, we're going to use a nonlinear solver, so fsolve, for example, to find the structural shocks that make the model equal to the data in that first period, let's say, okay? And so in that nonlinear solver is going to give me all the structural shocks for the first period, okay? So then I'm going to feed those shocks to the model using the extended path method, and I'm going to move to the second period, okay? And then I'm going to do the same. In the second period, I'm going to use a nonlinear solver to find the shocks that make the model equal to the data, and so on and so forth. So that's why it's costly to do it, and this is one reason why we're still unable to estimate the model, because every period you have to do this nonlinear solver algorithm to find the structural shocks that allow the model to match the data.
Okay, so you're not actually using, okay, I thought you're building somehow directly on Linear, but no, you have something.
No, it's not like we click a function or a button in Linear. It uses Linear routines, so it is relatively easy to. So, for example, it will use mod files. So we have the mod files and the steady state, everything in the Linear language. But when it comes to running the estimation itself, it's a function that we've programmed.
Sorry, thank you very much for that question and so on. I still would like to understand more about that. It's like, for example, the way that you described it was very intuitive, that new information comes on GDP, say, okay?
Yeah.
And I've had some previous views about shocks. I assume that they've come from somewhere. I've inherited the economy as it exists today, and so I could see using the model to solve for what the shocks would be. Okay, but where does the whole process start? Like, what do you mean by the extended path method? That's what I'm a little confused about.
Yeah. So you need, as I was saying, you need some initial condition to initialize the filter, right? So this is going to be the same as when you use the Kalman filters, say, to estimate like a linearized model. So the way we set up the way we initialize the filter is we first run the Kalman smoother actually in the linearized model, and we get those latent states for all the endogenous variables in the model, save for the endogenous variables that are only present in the nonlinear model, for example, price dispersion. So those are, say, price dispersion is going to be initialized at 0, which is close to the steady state anyway. And so we're going to take that smoothed state from the Kalman smoother and say, okay, this is going to be our initial condition to initialize the nonlinear filter. And then from that state onwards, you are going to say, so the model is going to be faced with the first observation of data, and it's going to search for the shocks that make the initial state consistent with the, with the data in the first period. And as I was saying, that will give you one set of structural shocks for the first period. Then, you simulate the model with that shock, with those shocks to move into the second period. And again, the model faces some data, and you need to back out the shocks that make the model consistent with the data in that second period, and so on. So that's how the filter sort of iterates forward. So at every period in time, you are going to be feeding the shocks that you extracted from the previous period. And the only difference basically with the linearized model is that you are going to be using the fully nonlinear solution, and that this filter is going to be one-sided as opposed to like two-sided, like in the Kalman smoother notion, because you are only taking past information into account when you go and filter your shocks.
But in the very first step, you linearized around something. What was that?
Yeah, the steady state. So you linearize around the steady state.
So the deterministic steady state, or
the deterministic steady state, exactly.
Okay, good.
So and that's consistent with our approach, because as I was saying, this nonlinear solution method imposes certainty equivalence anyway. So the non-stochastic steady state is a relevant concept for us to work also in the nonlinear world. So yeah, so that's how we parameterize the model and estimate and parameterize the model and do the simulations and filtering. So I'm gonna now move and show you some results. So this is how the Phillips curves look like in the linearized and nonlinear model when we simulate the model with demand shocks only. And in particular here, I'm showing you monetary policy shocks only. So this is only feeding monetary policy shocks to the model. So in the y-axis here, you have inflation. In the x-axis, you have the output gap, and note that the axis is reversed. So you have negative values on the right. That's such that we can have this nice banana shaped in like downward sloping way. And this cross here is giving you the steady state values. So for inflation and the output gap, okay? So what you see in the blue dots is the Phillips curve in the linearized model, and it's not surprising that this is a downward sloping, basically linear relationship between output gap and inflation, right? This is by construction. Now the interesting part is the red crosses that show you the Phillips curve in the nonlinear model, and you see here that around the non-stochastic steady state, this is going to be very close to the linearized model. But the interesting thing is, if you are in a deep recession, say, and you go to the lower right part of the chart, you see that the Phillips curve starts flattening. And this means that, for a given change in economic activity, you're going to see very minor changes in inflation, okay? And, by the same token, if you are on the upper left side of the chart, when you are in like a large boom, you're going to see that the Phillips curve becomes rather steep. Okay, and that means, you know, for a given change in output, you are going to have a large increase in inflation. So as I was saying, this is one part of the story, and this is one key first result of the paper. Now, the second part of the story, which is it's actually the more important bit when it comes to understanding inflation post-COVID, is the propagation of cost push shocks. And we know this because, like, we know that you know, a large part of inflation after the pandemic was driven by cost push shocks. Okay, so I'm going to now show you what happens if I feed a cost push shock to each of these curves around these different states that I'm showing you in this chart. So I'm going to feed a shock, you know, when the output gap is very negative, when it's around the steady state, and when it becomes very positive. And I'm going to compare how these curves shift outward in response to that shock. Okay. So this is what comes out. So you see in the blue dots, this line, you know, going through these blue dots, that in the linearized model, the shift is in parallel outward. And this shouldn't come as a surprise, because we know that in the linearized model, a cost push shock will propagate by the same magnitude, irrespective of the state of the economy. Okay, so that's, you know, we should have known that already. Now, the interesting part is what happens for the red crosses that give you the responses of the nonlinear model to a cost push shock. And you see that the Phillips curve here doesn't really shift outward, but it really tilts outward, where you see that when you are in a deep recession, for example, a cost push shock barely has any effect on inflation. And you see that in these dots in the lower right in the chart, right? But when you are going through a boom and inflation is elevated, you see that the same size of the shock can have very large increases, can trigger very large increases in inflation. Okay, so that's the second part of the paper. And these two facts combined allow us to deliver, or allow the model to deliver like a distribution of inflation that is going to be much more in line with the data. Now, you may say all of this is conditional on demand shocks, right? And we know, you know, we know that to understand inflation, both demand and supply forces can be important. So I'm going to show you now what happens, or we're going to move into like a much more thorough analysis of propagation of shocks when the model is driven by different underlying forces. So we're going to have demand shocks, supply shocks. Actually, we're going to do this for all the underlying drivers of the model. We're going to then feed a one standard deviation price cost push shock during periods of high and low inflation for all these simulations. And we are going to compute the average 1 year effect of this shock across different states, okay? For all underlying shocks of the model, okay? So what comes out of this? So here I'm showing you two shocks, okay? So here I'm showing you the responses. If you focus on the left-hand side chart first, I'm showing you the inflation responses, the 1 year ahead response of inflation to a price cost push shock when the model is driven by monetary shocks. So again, this is the same simulations that I was showing you in the previous slide with the Phillips curves. Okay, so in the horizontal line here in black, you have the response of the linearized model. So this is telling you in the linearized model, a one standard deviation cost push shock triggers an increase in inflation of something like 0.5%. Okay, and this is going to be the same, of course, irrespective of the state. Now, the nonlinear model is depicted by these blue dots here. And what this tells you is what we were also referring to before in the previous slide with the Phillips curves. When initial inflation is low, the same shock will trigger a relatively low response of inflation, okay? But when inflation is elevated, the same size of the shock is going to trigger a relatively large increase in inflation in the nonlinear model, okay? So this is similar to what we had seen before. Now, what is more interesting is what happens on the right here. So on the right, we have the same exercise, but when the underlying force for inflation dynamics is the price cost push shock, instead of the monetary shock. And on top of this, we're adding an additional price cost push shock at each point in time during the simulations. So what you see here as the main difference is that look at the variation in the x-axis in this chart. So we see that inflation varies much more when the underlying driver is a cost push shock as compared to a monetary shock, okay? And what this implies is that despite the fact that the slope in these lines is roughly the same, the slope in this, if you were to like fit like a regression to these clouds, we see that because there is much more variation in the x-axis here, the variability in the inflation responses is much larger when you have cost push shocks. So inflation is going to respond anything from like 0.25% in response to a shock to something like maybe 2 or 2.5% when inflation is elevated. Say if initial inflation before the shock is something like 8%, the same cost push shock can trigger a response of something like 2 percentage points over 1 year. So this highlights that when the economy is driven by cost push shocks and inflation is elevated, we're going to see much more inflation risk. Now, why do we see so much inflation risk, or if you want, heteroscedasticity in this cloud? So you see that this is not really a tight line anymore, but it's really a cloud of dots. And as I was saying, when inflation is, for example, 8%, it can respond anything from 0.5% to something like 2%. This is because it's not only the level of inflation before the shock what matters, but also whether inflation is increasing or decreasing. Now, before I move into that, I just want to make the case that this same exercise, we repeat this for all the shocks in the model, and we get the same for all underlying shocks, whether it's risk premium, fiscal shocks. So this is going to be a feature of the model that is going to hold irrespective of the underlying driver. But we of course focus on cost push shocks as drivers because this is the shock that delivers is the main driver of inflation in the model. So it's going to be the key element to focus on. So going back to this heteroscedasticity idea, why there is so much inflation risk in when the economy is driven by cost push shocks? So we separate the cloud of dots that I was showing you before, depending on whether inflation is increasing or decreasing before the shock. And I'm going to plot here the density of those 1 year responses, depending on whether inflation was increasing or decreasing before the shock. So here in blue, you have the distribution of inflation responses when inflation is descending before the shock, okay? In black, you have the density of all the simulations that I was showing you before. And in red, you have the density of the impulse responses, the 1 year responses, when inflation is increasing before the shock. And you see that when inflation is increasing before the shock, you have much more mass to the right. And in fact, you have a much fatter and larger tail to the right. So this means that in addition to the level of inflation, in the nonlinear model, inflation is going to respond much more aggressively when inflation is increasing as compared to decreasing. And this increase or decrease, so this rate of change, we compute simply as the 1 period change in the inflation rate in the model. So basically just like, T, the variation between T and T minus 1. Okay. So that should already give you the intuition of why the nonlinear model is going to do better when trying to understand inflation dynamics, especially when inflation is elevated. Okay, because it has these properties that make the inflation distribution consistent with the empirical properties of inflation in the data. So now that we have established that, we're going to look at monetary policy trade-offs at the current juncture, or at our latest observation in this paper, which is 2022 Q1. And the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to compute impulse responses to a monetary shock, to a cost push shock, and then to a monetary shock to see, what are the differences between the nonlinear and the linearized model, and how the trade-off to stabilize inflation worsens when inflation is elevated in the nonlinear model, okay? So this is the impulse response to a cost push shock in 2022 Q1. In black, you have the linearized model, and you see that in response to this shock, the linearized model inflation increases by something like 1%, okay, and then starts decreasing towards the steady state. This is, of course, followed by an endogenous response of the policy rate and a decrease in output gap, okay? Now, if you feed the same shock to the nonlinear model at this point in time where inflation is elevated, we see that the response of inflation is more than twice as large as in the linearized model. Now, I want you to keep the absolute magnitude here in your mind. So this is more than 1 full percentage point higher, the response in the nonlinear model, okay? This again triggers a more aggressive response of the policy rule and a much larger drop in GDP. Now, this is already bad news for the central bank, because we know that if inflation is elevated and we face the same size of the shock, inflation is going to react much more, and this is going to be associated with a larger cost in terms of output. Now, but you as a central bank, if you wanted to fully undo the effect of this shock, what would you have to do that? And I'm gonna just show you now what happens when you feed a 1 standard deviation monetary shock in the same quarter, right? So this is still 2022 Q1. So you see that because inflation is elevated in this state, monetary policy also has more traction in the nonlinear model. So this is the response that you're seeing here. Inflation drops by more in the nonlinear model. However, look at the absolute numbers here. So inflation drops by more, but this is something like 0.15% more than in the linearized model. And we have to undo more than a full percentage point more of inflation that I was showing you in the previous slide. So you can see already from this exercise that the trade-off for the central bank is going to be much worsened when inflation is elevated. And this has, to some extent to do with the fact that the Phillips curve estimated in this model is relatively flat. But so this takes this fact in, I guess it puts this fact into perspective and says, it's not only the problem that the Phillips curve is relatively flat, but when inflation is elevated, that problem is going to become even more of a problem, because cost push shocks are amplified in a nonlinear model in a much stronger way than monetary shocks are when inflation is elevated. Okay, so now this is concerning, but how can we quantify this in a more systematic way? So I'm going to show you how we can do that. And I'm going to rely again here on model simulations. And I'm going to take the simulations that I was referring to earlier in the presentation. So this impulse responses where we were showing the 1 year ahead response to a cost push shock. So I'm going to take those simulations when we simulate the model with all shocks at the same time. So these are all the shocks estimated at their standard deviations are going to be active during these simulations. And the exercise that I'm showing you here is, what if we let the model run through many different states with all the shocks active? Then at each point in time, we feed one cost push shock, and then we ask the question, what would be the necessary tightening that would be required to bring inflation down and fully undo the effect of that shock for different initial levels of inflation, okay? So you are going to, simulate the model. The model is going to transit through many states where inflation is elevated, where inflation is around the steady state, and inflation is high, and we're going to do this exercise. So the left-hand side chart here is showing you that in the linearized model, again, in the horizontal black line here, in order to fully undo the effect of a cost push shock over 1 year, in the linearized model, you need something like 200 basis points of monetary tightening, okay? Now, in the nonlinear model, you have this blue line here, which says, if you are, if the model is in a state where inflation is low before the cost push shock hits, you're going to actually need less tightening than in the linearized model. And why is that? That's because the effect of the cost push shock will be somewhat muted in a low inflation state. Now, as you move to when initial inflation starts increasing before the shock hits, you see that the necessary tightening to undo the effect of a shock for the same size of a shock increases dramatically. So let's say inflation is of the order of 6% before the shock hits. This means in order to undo the effect of that cost push shock, you will need something like 500 basis points of monetary tightening. Okay, and this is of course associated, there's like a mirror image of that chart here on the right, which is showing you the output gap response. So that tightening is going to be associated with a much larger drop in the output gap. So this is the sense in which the policy trade-off for the central bank, it's amplified in some sense, in the sense that to undo the effect of a given size cost shock, you are going to need more tightening when inflation is high, and this is going to be associated with larger drops in output. Okay, I have just one more exercise to show you, and this exercise has to do with the empirical properties of the model during the post-COVID period. So finally, what we do here is we are going to do conditional forecasts on different points in time. So at 2020 Q4 is in the first row. Then we have 2021 Q2, 2021 Q4, and 2022 Q1. Okay, and I'm showing here in each column inflation, then the policy rate, and then GDP growth. In blue, we have the nonlinear model, and in black, we have the linearized model, and these dotted lines are 90% confidence bands. So I think this chart illustrates nicely how the model behaves when inflation is low, and how that changes when inflation starts increasing in terms of forecasting performance. So if we start with 2020 Q4, where inflation was still relatively low, it was close to target, and in fact, it was receding, we see that the median forecast in the solid lines is almost the same between the linearized and nonlinear model. However, if you look at the confidence bands, you see that the linearized model actually has much more downside risk, and the nonlinear model has somewhat more upside risk. So here you can see already the very asymmetric properties of the inflation distribution in the nonlinear model. Okay. Now, as inflation starts increasing, so you see that in 2021 Q2, inflation was already higher and increasing. We see already that the median forecast for the nonlinear model is above the linearized model. And again, look at how asymmetric the confidence bands are for the nonlinear model. So the nonlinear model has less downward inflation risk and much higher upside inflation risk. In fact, if you look at the realizations of inflation after 2021 Q2, you see that all subsequent inflation realizations are within the confidence bands of the nonlinear model. And this is not the case for the linearized model. And the same happens, as you move further down the road and inflation keeps increasing, right? So you see that the median forecast for the nonlinear model becomes higher and higher, and the confidence bands also again feature this very asymmetric pattern, giving much more sort of weight or probability to high realizations of inflation and lower probability to lower realizations of inflation. Now, this is associated with, of course, a stronger response of the policy rate and more probability mass to higher interest rate increases down the road because of the higher inflation risk associated with the nonlinear model. So this translates also into giving more probability mass to sharper or more aggressive tightening paths for the central bank. And even to some extent, if you look at GDP growth, for example, in 2021 Q4, we see that this is also associated with larger downside risks for GDP, which in some sense speaks to this literature on growth at risk, where there is an asymmetric distribution of GDP also, where GDP is somewhat more skewed towards having more downside risk in the nonlinear model. So that's pretty much what I had for today. So let me conclude. So the key takeaways and our key sort of message here is that our model explains the modest decline in inflation that we saw during the Great Recession, and its recent post-COVID surge better than the standard workhorse, Smets and Wouters model. The key for this is going to be that we have a nonlinear Phillips curve and state-dependent propagation of cost-push shocks. And finally, we also show that inflation risk is much higher when inflation is elevated. And I think this is an important message because, it is particularly important for central banks to sort of try to stop inflation before it gets too high, because when it's high, it's going to be even harder to try to bring it down.